We begin with the father and son, Melvin Van Peebles and Mario Van Peebles. How did this film come about, and what was the sort of drive to make this movie about the Black Panthers?
Well, actually what happened is I had been working on a novel for about 15 years about the Panther Party, and we'll go into that later on. But just as I was in the last draft of the novel, I showed it to Mario. I said, "Hey, son, you got any ideas or any thoughts on this?" And Mario's always full of surprise. He came back, he said, "Yeah, Dad, it'd make a great screenplay." Yeah. I said, "Screenplay?" He said, "Yeah, it'd make a great movie." And that was the genesis of it. So I took the screenplay, I took the novel and did the screenplay version. And that's what we've been doing. The Panther movie I directed by Mario and written by me, and we both produced it along with another fellow named Preston Holmes.
Yeah, who also, he produced New Jack City, didn't he?
Preston's, actually, Dad started him quite some time ago.
Yeah, many years ago.
But he produced New Jack City with me, and then Posse with me, the Western, which also became known as Unforgiven, and Panther, which was a real tough one. But we were on the train back from Philadelphia, and he kept talking about this book, and I said, "This is so visual. It's a part of history that so many of us know so little about because the Panthers were so misrepresented.
Tell me about that, because if you go into be a movie. If you go into a community today, let's say a community, an African American, let's assume we went up to Harlem and we got together a group of kids who were 14 years old. Would they know about the Panthers? Would they know
Many
about
of them wouldn't.
Huey Newton and Bobby Seale and the others?
We did some research. A lot of kids didn't. One kid thought, he said, "Huey Newton, yeah, isn't that a cookie?" Yeah. So, you know, there's a lot of the history we don't get. We learn about victimization more than we do about some other things. And the Panther Party had an appeal that went across racial lines, and it really appealed to what, you know, Marx called the lumpen proletariat, the brother and sister on the block. Yeah. So
that was very frightening. That was one of the things about the Panther Party. Even though they were painted in the media, the press, as violent, anti-white, etc., they were not at all. In fact, they were really on the cutting edge of a lot of things that have since been absorbed into the life of America. That is, they had the breakfast programs. At one time, the leader of the entire party was a woman, Elaine Brown. Yeah. They also started sickle cell anemia testing in the community. A lot of community-based things they did.
Survival programs.
Yeah. But you got to remember that the past history is the past written by the winner. So it's not surprising that the Panthers have all but been eradicated, nor is it an accident from the general consciousness, because since they were talking about something so broad, so American as apple pie, that made them more dangerous.
Look, this is the Black Panther newspaper, I guess.
That's correct.
And look here, this was a cover story called Sweetback, which was about you made the film, what, 25 years ago? Is that about right?
I was just out of grade school when I made that movie. That's right. Yeah, I made it.
71, so that's 23 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. And here they are. Guess what we got in here? There's a whole story about the film. And look here, there is a picture here of, I guess this is a young boy about to be baptized into manhood, and guess who it is? Young Mario.
Yep, that was Mario. Yeah. That's correct. Exactly. He played the young me in the movie because the movie starts with Sweetback as a child, and then he goes on up to manhood, and then so Mario plays the earlier Sweetback.
Now look at this. This is a nice picture here. This is a picture, I guess, from making of the film. Yes. Yeah. There's Mario with his
Dad giving me his free advice
cap on. And you're giving him free advice?
He's giving me free advice.
Oh, yeah.
And you know what you do with free advice, right?
Would you pay for it or what? Yeah. Burst onto the scene in America with Sweetback. And people said, I mean, you really created the genre. What happened? I mean, why didn't you go on to make other films that had even greater success?
Oh, well, that is, of course, a political and an economic question. I.e., I burst on the scene, per se, but I had been plotting Sweetback for 13 years before I got to
Granddad used to say, luck is preparation meets opportunity.
Yeah. What happened was I was in France because I used to be an astronomer, but I had an opportunity to go to France to make films. Yeah. And when I was there, what happened was I discovered there was a French law that said a French writer could get a director's card. So I turned myself into a writer. and I published 5 novels in French. And when I wrote my first 2 novels, I couldn't get them published. I then became a journalist. By being a journalist, that got me publicity. That allowed me to get my novels published. Now I'm going to get my novels published. Then I asked for a director's card. Then when I asked for a director's card, I asked for a director's card to make a film flattering to the French, who then granted me the director's card.
Yeah.
And then after I made Watermelon Man for Columbia, because I embarrassed the establishment, I thought, I just looked at the demographics, there were a whole bunch of brothers and sisters out there who thought as I did, who had never, up to that time, it was considered there was no black audience, black films were not successful.
Yeah.
And my argument was, how would you know?
Because you haven't seen any.
You haven't seen any.
And the interesting thing about Sweetback is that it sold more tickets than Mahogany, which was made by Motown, Jungle Fever made by, and Do the Right Thing, both made by Spike Lee.
And also, in Sweetback, only 2 theaters in the entire United States would show it. Yeah. When it first came out, only 2 theaters, one in Detroit, who hadn't opened the mezzanine in 15 years up to that time, and one in Atlanta, Georgia, were the only 2 places. I
remember seeing it. I was living in New York at the time. I remember seeing it when it came out. Thinking,
well, of course, you know, the business of America is business. Once it hit, of course, everybody called me up.
But 2 of the things, I don't know if he talked about these things with you, but you once said that the best advice you'd ever gotten from your father was early to bed, early to rise, work like a dog, and advertise.
Right.
Yes. Did he actually say that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he did. I had, you know, I asked him, I said, because part of what you were saying, Charlie, was why didn't he get the chance to go on to do it again, which is a good question. But one of the things that Dad kept saying was show business is a business. If you can sort of, you know, learn to articulate the numbers a little bit, know the business side, you do yourself a big favor. He said he learned how to make money and not necessarily enough about how to spend it. Right. Got a BA in economics, went to Columbia, worked for Koch. I wasn't, you know, this was after the fiscal crisis, so that wasn't my fault. But I started trying to get back into the arts. I wanted to direct and act. So I went to take my dad to his favorite Chinese-Cuban restaurant because I thought maybe he'd help me get back in the business. And I took him, I fed him and everything, and then he said, okay, I'll give you great free advice once again. Yeah. And it was early to bed, early to rise, work like a dog, and advertise. Yeah. And so I started doing a lot of theater. And you were talking about Mark Twain earlier. He had a great quote, something about, all my life my father was an idiot, and at 21 he was a genius, meaning I sort of understood in retrospect that I had done it to some degree on my own, which is, I think, it's important.
That's a very difficult point for a parent. What point can you help and let help be crippling? And I thought Mario, I had a secret weapon with Mario. He's extremely ambitious and hardworking. And I thought that those 2 things would bring him around to my way of thinking. All I had to do was wait. And I would not help him, not because I couldn't have helped him, but he would never have known that he was his own man. Yeah.
So you wanted him to sort of, you wanted to throw him in the river and let him swim.
Yeah, I figured he could swim. Yeah.
You figured he'd swim because you could see him.
Yeah.
Did you go to directing in part because it was what you wanted to do, or was part of it a kind of thing, look, I'm going to learn to direct because my father, you know, the lesson that he gave me was you got to understand the business of this thing, and I want to be not just dependent on my acting skills, but I want to be able to make my own movies regardless of whether I'm in them as an actor or not.
Probably I went into directing for more reasons than I would know. What I can say, one of the big factors was, very simply, I came into a situation where I experienced racism for the first real direct time, because, you know, growing up again with Dad and going to school, I didn't really hit it directly. I went to see, actually it was Calvin Klein. They were seeing a bunch of models. And I had found this great part-time job that they would pay me to take my picture and do this stuff. And I went with a bunch of people, and they had some black girls there and some other fellas, and they saw everybody but me. And at the end, when they started turning out the lights, I said, what's the problem? And the lady said, oh, should I be honest? I said, yes. And she said, well, you know, we would never really use a black guy in an underwear ad. I said, really? And she said, yes. And I said, oh. And I said, but you had Iman up here. And she said, yes. He said, but it's a business dominated by, you know, white males, so they would like to fantasize about your sister, but they don't necessarily want you in the underwear ad. And she started, what business do you want to go in? And I said, I want to act. And she was talking about, well, James Bond could jump into bed with Grace Jones, or Captain Kirk could kiss a green woman, but you probably won't see the reverse a lot. And I started thinking, and if you look at Ghost, the sexy young couple's white and the funny one's black, and if you look at most of our big stars have been in comedy where they could make the dominant culture laugh. So as I went out to L.A. and started acting, I started doing all these crazy character parts because I couldn't get the other stuff. So I realized that it would take me as a director to make New Jack City and put Wesley Snipes in one role, and I saw him as Pacino, and put Judd Nelson, who's Jewish, in another role, and Russell Wong, who's Asian, or to do movies like The Panther Story, or a Western, you know, the first 44 settlers of Los Angeles, 26 were black. But you'd never see that in the old Westerns. Just as if you watch Rocky 1, 2, and 3 long enough, you would start to forget that there are boxers like Foreman.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Because the dominant culture would place itself in the foreground. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just a fact. So I couldn't change it as an actor. And part of the wonderful thing that you asked me earlier was, what did I learn from Dad? Is he wasn't bitter. And that was key. There's a lot. It's very easy to get angry, and the anger can poison your work. I mean, so I think one of the things that I learned from him was get out and do something about it. You're going to face racism or whatever, sexism or whatever it is at the post office, so you might as well be in the field you want to be in. So as a director, I was able to be a filmmaker, and as an actor, I was able to respond to the films that were being made.
Yeah. There is much said these days about the rage of black men. There is at the Whitney Museum.
Yes.
An exhibition now.
Okay, using that as a defense thing for that.
For Ferguson.
Yeah.
Yeah,
For
it was a Long
Jamaican
Island
guy, that
Railroad.
Long Island,
Yeah,
yeah.
he was representing himself, and there are all kinds of things involved there. But Bob Herbert did a whole long discussion the other Sunday in the New York Times Magazine. Tell me how you feel about that. I mean, the point is, in America today, it's very difficult. I think the point is made frequently to be, a black man in America today.
Well, you asked a question earlier, which could, if I didn't have other arcs, other bows in my other arrows in my quiver, actually have probably generated a great deal of rage. For example, once I did Sweetback and threw on the table an entirely new formula, what happened was, with this formula, I was frozen out with the ability to make this. And then the major studios started making. I remember when Shaft, the movie Shaft, when I first saw the script while I was making Watermelon Man, Shaft was white. And at the success of Sweetback, then they just changed black. Yeah. They just changed the black and threw some. But
the first of what we call black exploitation films, weren't they?
Exactly.
Right.
And so, but I expected that, so I wasn't surprised. That was just good business.
Yeah.
It's pretty low down and cheap and cowardly, but it was good business.
After he finished New Jack City, you weren't surprised that they wanted him. Every Hollywood saw how good the film was and what he'd done and how good he could handle actors.
No, they didn't, Charlie. They saw it made money. They didn't call me the first weekend out. It was the third weekend where the numbers were going up. They said, boy, is that kid talented.
They didn't say you're a good director. They said your films make money, so therefore we want to talk about the street.
It's a business, man.
We're only talking money here. And I knew, just like if you would go back to the track analogy, if you're running track and you're a ringer, when I did Sweetback, the reason I was able to do it was I promised white people 2 for 1. I promised them they could feel liberal by helping me, and they'd have their racist theories vindicated by my failure. When I didn't fail, when I didn't do part 2,
they could make something on the investment.
Right? They said, "Oh, see, we tried to help." But when it became the largest grossing independent film ever made up to that time, and remember, I got no partners. I got no partners because nobody would go in with me. I owned the book, I owned the album, I owned everything. When the Motion Picture Association refused to gave me an X, I put on the thing, rated X by an all-white jury because they were all white. And so I could turn that, but that's an idiosyncratic way of looking at life that's able to flip things around. However, what happened was, just let me finish this one point. What happened was, I felt that this was going to happen, and I felt there was another place that we needed to go next. And that was Broadway. And that's when I brought out my shows on Broadway. And I took the money that I had from Sweetback and supported these shows to get them started until they got started. And people said, well, how can you how can you use your money like that? It's not my money. It's the money I was able to bring from the community as a whole, and then I was in custody of that money. And I thought the next thing that we would have to do was to start to conquer Broadway. So that, because if you conquer something, if you don't have to do it with a grant,
right.
if we're in a capitalist society, you better make capital. Once you make capital, everything is forgiven. So because I was able to do that, then I said, I took that capital and went to theater. Then in the theater, I didn't like the music that was available to us, so I invented a whole new musical style, which is now called rap and hip-hop, et cetera, et cetera. And so then my album started going and so forth.
Yeah.
So that's...
But Charlie, if I may, the question of rage, I was lucky enough to be taught and to go to school. So when your plate is full, it's a whole different thing. We're able to make films and survive. So the system, to some extent, is working for us, whether it was harder or whatever. When I was doing Panther, Stanley Clark's doing the composing. Played with Chick Corea, I remember, big, great jazz guy. And this guy came in, he's a violinist, great violinist, and he's a black fella, and we start talking, he's a brother, and he says to me, he starts talking, and I said, I want to ask you a question. He said, you want to know how I got into playing the violin, don't you? Because he sounded like he was from the street. Okay. So I said, yes, I did. He said, you know what? I grew up in Compton.
Compton, California.
Compton, rough neighborhood. I grew up in Compton. He said, and I was going to the school, and they had this little band, the school band, and no one wanted to play the damn violin. I was the smallest guy, so I got stuck playing the violin, and my teacher thought I had potential, and I went on from there. He said, the year after I left that school, the programming got cut for the band, and that was the year they started the Crips.
Yeah, the gang.
If I had gone 1 year later, when the funding got cut, I'd have belonged to the Crips. Well, I'm like that kid with the violin. I'm able to do something, but I'm lucky. There are guys smarter than me that'll never get the shot. You know what I mean? So
for example, I'm from the South Side of Chicago. The reason I'm not in jail with the rest of my earlier gang is because I looked very young. And I was young, but I looked peculiarly young and puny. And when the cops would come around in my neighborhood, they would take your hands and they would feel. And if you didn't have blisters, it meant that you didn't have a job, because all you could have is a labor job, and they'd just take you to jail. And we used to call jail California. But because I looked so young, I was outside of that.
They didn't take you to jail.
But that can be an extremely rageful thing. That can be an extremely rageful thing.
Did Posse make money?
It made enough money for us to do Panther.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Same company.
Same company.
They're
not in the business.
Same producer, but...
Same producers and everything like that. Now, the interesting thing about that was, after New Jack, they were offering me a lot of New Jack movies. Yeah. And I wanted to go away.
Mainly about drugs and...
I wanted to go away from the hood and have some fun and go to the West. It made enough box office, and it was huge on video. And with those two elements, it's the whole package.
What opportunities do you have today as a director? Other than, you're making Panther, you finished making Panther. What are the options for Mario Van Peebles?
They're probably different from other directors, even though we get sort of compared as a sort of cinematic basketball team. Because I think the more films you make, the more people start to say, well, you know what, maybe Bill Duke can do Cemetery Club, and maybe Mario can do some big action picture. So I'm actually, at this point, getting to read other scripts. But women have the same problem. If you're a chunky guy with red hair, you're going to get cast in chunky guy with red hair parts. But I'm able, as a director, I'm leading a lot of offers. Coppola is Italian. He did Godfather, but he also did a pretty good job with Apocalypse Now. And no one was eating pasta, and he went outside of his own sort of ethnic experience with it. So I hope, as a director, to go beyond the films I've made and do other ones.
And you look to act again?
Oh yeah. I'm maybe doing something on the Tuskegee Airmen just as an actor. That's great. After you've done the hard work of directing, it's so nice. I was talking to Jodie Foster about that. I said, when you're acting, do you find you want to direct? And we both agree it's like being a plumber on vacation in Hawaii. The last thing you want to do is look under the sink. You're just happy that someone else is competent in doing the work.
And when Jodie directed, did she direct herself? I've forgotten. I know she tried to direct something.
Herself.
Did she do Nail? Did she direct? No, she didn't direct Nail.
But she produced Nail. Her company did, so she could have chosen anyone she wanted to, and she chose someone else.
Yeah.
Has there been tension between the two of you at times? I mean, have there been periods in which you weren't as close and you weren't communicating the way you are now?
I think so. I mean, you know, we have different artistic. One of the things Dad wanted on Panther was that, you know, everything's very authentic and he really knows the time. And one of the things I wanted was that the movie was, you know, a good movie or not, was understood or could be understood by someone that knew nothing about the time. And I think that dynamic made it a better film, so that, you know, we have.
I don't really.
But that's not really a personal tension.
Right.
That's an artistic difference.
But have you stayed in touch? I mean, have you always sort of known where each other were and talked on, you know, on a consistent basis?
I'd say pretty much.
Yeah, pretty much. No
Okay,
problem.
there's been never been a period where you were sort of disparate, separate.
No, not with any of it.
And then what about his mother? She's German, yes? She was German?
No, she's from Virginia.
From Virginia?
From Virginia, yeah. She went to school to Ohio Wesleyan, where I went to college. She went to Ohio Wesleyan, the same school. And however, she went after I was flying. I used to be in the Air Force, you know, in Strategic Air Command, and someone gave her my my address when she was coming to San Francisco, where I was flying in Sacramento at the time, and we met, and that's how we met.
It's great to have you here. Thank you very much.